Hey everyone, wanted to welcome you to this month's edition of the Agile at Scale meetup for Agile Austin, a longtime special interest group here at Agile Austin. And yeah, I've got a great presentation lined up for today. But first, kind of gonna want to go through a few things related to Agile Austin and what we're about. So we are a 501c6 nonprofit, and our mission, we love to connect people, foster professional growth through events just like this. And communication, that's always key. So our board for this year, Max Casey, our esteemed president, he joins a lot of these SIGs. So if he's around, I'm sure you'll see him in the chat and he'll wave and say hi. And if not, I think he may also be on the road. But we also have Sid Markle, Chase Callaghan, myself, I'm CTO, and Jenny Halcomb, our treasurer. Great board, fantastic folks I'm working with. Wanted to say thank you to our sponsors. All of them have recently either re-upped or are new. Agile Velocity is our platinum sponsor, longtime Agile consulting company in the community, and they have done a great job of sponsoring us. So we're very thankful for their support. We also have a gold sponsor, ResumeX, who recently came on board with us. I think the deadline is passed for a workshop that they're going to have, but you can always check out their site, which I'll post in the comment section for information on that. The workshop that they have is coming up, but I think that deadline passed. So anyways, yeah, that's all happening. And so, um, and then the silver sponsor, Ad Melior Coaching, also a longtime sponsor of our organization. So again, throw some links in the chat after I'm done here with this part. So Agile Velocity also has the public workshops that they have from time to time. You can use the code Agile Austin for a 15% discount on it. And then if you would like to join these sponsors and help us out in terms of our finances, you can hit us up at contact@agileaustin.org, or you can also help sustain us by becoming a member. And the membership fee is only $35, which is pretty cool. So, and then in terms of the other meetups that we have our book club, which has been going strong for quite a number of years now. Ned Horvath continues to run that, so we thank him for his continued efforts. We also have Agile Coaching SIG, which usually meets in the evenings, about once a month or so. And then Product and AI SIG, which we recently kicked off. And so that's been having a lot of fun with that with Matt Roberts and Vishal Sheth. And then the later SIG, of course, with Max, which is, I think, about 15 years of that, which is pretty amazing. Got an anniversary coming up for it, and then Lean Kanban as well. So we also have a professional development scholarship. You can apply for that. I'll post the comments on the meetup page in the comment section of the meetup page afterward, a link to get there. But the we want to give back to our community, and we are doing that by piloting a program to sponsor some scholarships for folks that might be interested in kind of upping their game. Could be on the Agile front, elsewhere. It is open to just members of Agile Austin only for reference, but post more details on the meetup page after this. And oops, well, I accidentally hit that link. So that's the link there. Get back into the slideshow. As you can see, it's a Google form. So Agile at Scale SIG, we've been doing this since 2016. Leland Newsom, I joined him a few years ago. And yeah, while we were in person before the pandemic, since then we've been on Zoom for the most part, done a few hybrids, maybe do some of those next year as well. Upcoming, so Matt Roberts, topic coming soon. He shared some of the stuff he will be presenting with me, and really awesome content. So should have more details on that. Hopefully here before the end of November for early December. And looks like a little typo on the December month, but it's okay. So January, we've got Daniel Walsh topic coming soon, and then February, Michael McCullough, why flow metrics are not enough. So a lot of great topics and speakers coming up in the next few months. But for today, really looking forward to Candace's presentation on behavior-driven development when there are no users. And so in just a moment, I'm going to hand it off to her. But you can hit us up at leland.newsome@agileaustin.org or ben.rogers@agileaustin.org. And we will be happy to get you sorted. Always looking for new presenters in the coming year. Or anything else related to scaling topics. Happy to have a conversation about those. So I'm going to stop sharing and I am going to pass the baton off here to Candace. So thank you, Candace. Take us away.
No worries. Welcome, everyone. Uh, so I'll probably go off camera here in a bit because I hate talking when people are watching me, but I'll start on camera to say hi. So I am a business architect at Argonne Digital. Lately, we've been really focused a lot on automation. Historically, we've done a lot of product management. That's kind of my role. But in the last few years, we've been doing a lot of process automation, especially of complex business processes. And so that and several of my past projects led me to this talk. And the origin of this talk, behavior-driven development when there are no users, really starts 8-ish years ago. So I had been working on lots of projects as a product manager, product owner, but primarily user-centric. So UI interactions. Gherkin was pretty straightforward. You just kind of follow the steps and, we could do BDD. And then I got my first kind of technical backend project. It was a credit adjudication project. I had to learn what APIs were. I did not know what an API was, so that was exciting. And I scoured the internet. I was like, surely there's guidance on how to write Gherkin or behavior-driven development style acceptance criteria for these backend API database projects. And I searched and I searched and I searched. And even when I put technical in the keywords or API, I still got the same guidance that was like, well, when the user does something, I'm like, no, 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 there are no users. So, like a good product owner, I gave up. Um, so I decided on that project to not write Gherkin acceptance criteria. I fell back to kind of old habits of just kind of checklist, and we'll talk about those in a bit. And that worked for a while. It was a small team. There were only about 10 of us, not a huge product. But my very next project, 2018 or so, we knew it was going to be huge. It ended up growing to 15 development teams across 4 continents, well over 100 developers, all on one code base. We knew to move quickly, we were going to have to do automated testing. And so to help facilitate that automated testing, I went back to Gherkin. How can I write those Gherkin style acceptance criteria to help our developers write those automated tests? And while I still couldn't find any guidance out there in the world, I decided to figure out myself. So this presentation now is roughly 6 years of experience, trial and error of working with my development teams to figure out what is different when you're writing these BDD acceptance criteria for your backend systems, and does it really help? And I'll give you kind of the sneak preview is I do think it helps. That's why I'm here. So that's what we're going to cover. And with that, I will go off camera if I can find my controls, and we'll jump right in. Okay. There's my controls. So our agenda for today, I'll do a quick intro to behavior-driven development and behavior-driven development style acceptance criteria. It is in the title, so I assume most people are at least familiar with it, but it helps to just level set everybody. We'll talk a little bit about how behavior-driven development differs when we're talking system-to-system interactions. So that's what I'm going to call these kind of back-end interactions as opposed to user-to-system interactions, which is what we more typically see in like a UI-focused project. With that, outside of that, we'll talk about 2 mindset shifts. They're pretty small, but they're make big differences when you're writing acceptance criteria, and especially when you're automating those acceptance criteria. So we'll talk about mindset shift 1, which is preconditions and triggers, and our shift 2, which is thinking about scenarios versus steps. We'll have some practice. Typically, we would do that in groups, but it looked like we did not have breakout rooms, so we'll probably just do that individually, and we can come back together and get feedback, and then we'll do a quick recap, and then any time for Q&A. So what is behavior-driven development? Just to start off with kind of the highest level of our definitions. It really comes out of test-driven development and acceptance test-driven development, and it's all about really writing your tests first, thinking of that test first approach, understanding what it would take to pass your user story or your scenario, and then only building the code so that your tests pass and nothing more. It's really hopefully a way to prevent gold plating in our projects because we're not building for things that we don't need to. It is focused specifically on the behavior-driven development side. It focuses on the behaviors of the system and how the system reacts to various preconditions and triggers. So because of this, it's sometimes also called specification by example. Typically, when people are talking about BDD, they're typically thinking, well, they usually are referring to BDD style acceptance criteria. So Gherkin, or you'll also hear this called given, when, then. And writing our acceptance criteria in that format can really help be a powerful quality aid because we're really, again, focused on how do we know when we're done? How do we know when we've passed the test and can say, yep, this story meets our expectations and not building anything we don't need. So if I talk about BDD and that most of the time we're talking about BDD style acceptance criteria, well, then I want to make sure we're defining acceptance criteria as well. I'm sure most people know what they are, especially in the Agile world, but at the end of the day, the acceptance criteria are the conditions that our software product must meet in order for the story to be accepted by a user. So these are kind of our Agile equivalent of, old school system requirements or user requirements. So they are kind of the closest thing we have to those system shall statements from the waterfall world. And an interesting piece here is that these are always unique to each user story. So these are the specific things that a user story or a developer must demonstrate to say, yes, of that story that just said, as a user, I want some functionality so that I can get some benefit. Did I actually meet that user story? This is slightly different. It's not the topic for today, but slightly different from, say, a definition of done, where a definition of done is the things that every single user story in a sprint or a release or even the product must adhere to. But the acceptance criteria are specific to each user story. Because they are specific, there are several different types of acceptance criteria, right? There's no one right way to write how we know when our story is done. We have the behavior-driven development or Gherkin, so our given some precondition, when we have some trigger, then the system will do some action. That's what I see. That's my most common because it's very formulaic. It's easy for us to automate, but it's by no means the only way to write acceptance criteria. The second most common way that I see is kind of rule-oriented or checklist. So you think here just like a bullet list of, you know, if I am adding a search field on a UI, our checklist might be like the search field is placed across the top of the page, search kicks off when the user clicks search, search accepts 200 characters, search does wildcard searches, just basically a way to checklist the items as well. So that's kind of the second most common way. That's actually the one I fell back to when I couldn't figure out originally how to write Gherkin for my backend projects. And then you can have just various other types of custom ones. You can have stories, you can have text, you have examples of the behavior, you can have screenshots even. You can link out to visual models if you're trying to implement a decision table. You can just say the acceptance criteria is the logic matches this decision table. Today, however, because we are talking about BDD, aka Gherkin, we're going to focus on that Gherkin format. This is a format that I recommend. It is a little cumbersome, not going to lie. Takes a few minutes to get into that mindset, but once it's part of that rhythm or um, custom for you to do it, then it just becomes second nature. It's very easy to do it. And then I'm sure probably most people know, but just a little bit of trivia from the Gherkin history. It's called Gherkin because it was originally for Cucumber, which was kind of one of the first automated testing tools for using this given when then. And then Gherkin is a small pickled cucumber. So that is where the name comes from. And why do we want to write our acceptance criteria specifically in the BDD format? So acceptance criteria does lots of things for us just in general, but specifically writing it in this Gherkin given when then format, it helps us manage expectations because when we're able to write those clear acceptance criteria and give our developers a list of tests that they need to run through, it's easier for the developers to design, it's easier for the testers to test, and even our end users can say, okay, I know how I'm expecting the system to work. With that, of course, we can define the scope and reduce our ambiguity because we've listed, if I say I want a search functionality and I give you 5 test cases, probably more than 5, but let's go with 5, then I know what my scope is. And if I find additional acceptance criteria, then it goes, I'm going to use the word change management here in very like loose parentheses terms, or quotation mark terms. You go through whatever, change management you have. Either it becomes a new story in the next sprint, or if it's small enough, maybe the developer can accept it in the current story. But at least you have those clear boundaries of what is in scope for that sprint. And thus, if you find new things, you can have that conversation. It, of course, because acceptance criteria typically in the BDD format become our acceptance tests, they are our testing criteria. I have had so many projects lately where, sometimes I will do some test cases that are more end-to-end across systems, but many of my test cases are just one for one to my acceptance criteria. And so it really helps me by writing the acceptance criteria, then easily test it as a product owner. And then the last one kind of ties to the defining scope, but it defends against that scope creep as well, because again, you have that clear list of acceptance criteria you're working towards. And if something new comes in, you at least know it's new and you can have those discussions. So let's get into the specifics. So what are the components of the BDD acceptance criteria? So first, we're going to talk about kind of the typical generic user to system interaction behavior-driven development acceptance criteria. So they have the three components. The given is the precondition. So this sets the scene. This is everything we're asserting before we run our test case. This is what I think about as like our data setup. And this is true for both user to system interactions and system to system interactions, but it's more important in system to system, which we'll talk about soon. One big thing here that people don't always think about, especially in user to system interactions, is that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Each acceptance criteria doesn't have to have the full list of preconditions of how the user got to the current test case. As long as in that same story, we've covered it in some acceptance criteria, we can build upon the acceptance criteria. So if I'm saying, if I said in the previous acceptance criteria that the user logged in, right? So given they put in the right credentials when they click the login button, then, then the system logs them in. Well, I don't need to repeat that they entered the credentials and that the credentials were valid in all the subsequent steps. I can just say, well, given that the user's logged in, because they already did that. But this precondition is usually the state of the system or of the user as of the time of running the test case. So the user is logged in, they're viewing a page, they navigated somewhere. So this is setting the stage for how am I going to run this specific test case for this specific acceptance criteria. The trigger is our when. This is always something that has to be system recognizable. So it can't be that when the user wants to do something or when the user thinks about something, it's got to be something that the system can recognize. So clicking on something, submitting something, entering something, the system receiving something. Those are all triggers. We'll talk a little bit in the trigger in that when. You should never have ors or ands, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. And then finally, our post condition are then, this is everything the system does after that trigger. So anything that ends that test case. So the system displays something, it notifies someone, it validates something. These you can have a lot of ands in your post condition, but you should not have any or clauses, because or clauses mean that the system could do multiple things, which likely means you're missing either a precondition or you have a different trigger. I will say in user to system interactions, because you tend to be going step by step. So the user does something, triggers the system to do something, you can validate that. You don't have as many and clauses in user to system interactions, but you still can. So like if I submit an order and the system validates the order and sends the order to the order processing system and sends the user a confirmation, those are all things that happen from the one trigger that the user did, which was submitting the order. So let's look at a very simple example to see our Gherkin in action. So here, this is a search acceptance criteria. So given an item exists in the e-store, when the customer searches for it or submits the search criteria, then the system displays the item in the search results. And here we'll talk about in that mindset shift, it feels a little weird to say that with the given the item exists, but this is something that we have to assert before the test. As we're going in to test it, I can't just run any number of search criteria. I have to already know what exists in the e-store. So before I go in the UI and search, I might go in the database and say, oh yes, this item, my latitude 6200 does exist in the e-store. So that way when I run the search criteria, I already know the results that I'm expecting. You see the when, that's our system recognizable trigger. So when we actually submit the search results, not that I want to search for anything, and then what happens. So this is a very simple example. They can get much more complicated, and we'll see some of those in our exercise later on. So everything I've talked about so far has been user to system interactions. And typically that, even though you have to get your head around, the give and the when and the then, it's usually fairly intuitive for people to get into that mindset and to have a user kind of walk through their steps and think through that and say, okay, I trigger something, I do something, and the system reacts. And maybe you have to think a little bit about the preconditions. But when we shift that, when we go to system reactions, where there's no user input at all data, moving behind the scenes, how does that change? I was recently on a project where this was the case. It's a fully automated process between two HR systems, and it was basically keeping them in sync. So twice a day, the source system would submit files of all the changes, and then we would pick those up and process the changes into the target system. And while as the tester, I was interacting with these files, like, to do my assertions before the test, now that it's in production, nobody touches this. There's no user involved unless there's an error. So how do we write our acceptance criteria for that? And for this, what I've recognized over the 6 years of trial and error of writing these acceptance criteria is kind of two main key differences. And you'll see them on the slide, but I'm going to highlight them. The first is our precondition. So while fundamentally the precondition is still, it still is a precondition, the given is our preconditions, everything we have to check before the test. It's less about the user, right? Because there is no user, and a lot of times even less about the system. It's usually more about the state of the data. So the state the data is moving around. So the data could exist or not exist. The data may be in a certain state, right? So something could be approved or it could be pending. Or in the case of the HR system, if we were looking for employees, we would see if the employee was active or inactive or terminated. So it's the state of that data. And here this is similar to user to system, but even more important in system to system is I think of this as test case setup. So what is everything that I'm checking? It's maybe not even in my target system, but everything that I'm checking prior to running a test. So it's, again, small change, but thinking about the data instead of the user or the system. The next one is the trigger. Again, the trigger is still a trigger. It still has to be system recognizable. Uh-oh, I need to mute somebody so we can raise hands if we do have questions or anything. We'll have time for questions at the end as well. So our trigger is still the thing that starts the test case. Of course, it has to be system recognizable. It can't be intent, although hopefully if we're talking system to system, we're not talking rise of the machines yet for them to have intent. But specifically, this is two mindset shifts. One is you want to think about it from your system. So even if you have multiple systems that are interacting, whatever my application is, it's what triggers my application to do something. So if I'm, for example, a middleware system and I'm moving data between two systems, my trigger typically, and this is a very small tweak here, my trigger wouldn't be that the upstream system sent me the data. It would be that I received the data. And we'll talk a little bit in some of the examples of why this can matter, but you want it to be from your system's point of view. But again, it is typically this a system being an actor. So your system sends something, your system receives something, you get a message. Maybe it's a time bound, so some time occurred. That's the trigger that starts something. But it's that external trigger. The post condition largely remains the same. The only thing I would call out here is that typically in your system to system interactions, you tend to have longer acceptance criteria. We'll see some examples of this. But because you can't do as much step-by-step processing, because you can't stop, say, an automation in the middle of a process, your trigger could be I receive a request, and then the system does a lot of things. Maybe it has 10 steps that it's doing before it sends a response. And so your post conditions can have a lot more and clauses than typical user to system interactions. Okay. So let's break down each one of these before we get into the mindset shifts. For the given, these are fairly true of both user to system interactions, but we want to not overload the given clause if we can. We want only the required context for the scenario. And one of the things I've had trouble with this because, for example, I talked about that HR system. Well, each day we get this file of all the changes. And so I, at least once a story, have to say, well, how did I get to where I am in the processing of this file? So sometimes I'll just have a given that precedes all of my acceptance criteria so that I don't have to keep rewriting it. So you don't have to keep reinventing the wheel or rewriting things. Other tactics I've seen, if you do need to overload your given and you have a lot of preconditions, as you can sometimes highlight or color code what changes between the acceptance criteria to make it more clear of like what thing you're testing each time. It does, as we said, express a precondition. It can have multiple and clauses if you have multiple preconditions. It describes the state of either the system, user, or data. So typically in a system to system, you're talking the data. And it sets up the test. It is that test case setup. However, we do not, and this is true pretty much all of the pieces of our acceptance criteria, we're trying not to reflect technical implementation or developer actions. We're not trying to say technically how we got there and more how the system sent the data or what are we checking before we send the data. We don't want to put more information than is needed because it just makes it harder to read. I've definitely seen some really long acceptance criteria. The actions should always be in the trigger. So if you see an action happening in the precondition, you might want to think about that as something that's happened in the past versus happening now. And much like the trigger as well, this is not an intent because we can't validate a user's intent before a test case. We can only validate something that either exists or the state or where the user is if they are logged in, not that the user, say, wants to search for something. And as it says here, you can't describe anything that we can't verify. For our when clause, this describes the what. So this and not the how. So this describes the action that the user or system is taking, not necessarily how they got there. So how the system got to the place that it was sending us a request is not in the trigger. It is just that we got that request, we received it, or we sent a notification. It is a single action. So in this case, you want to avoid any and or clauses. So if you see an or clause, that means it's really two different acceptance criteria, even if it leads to the same post conditions, because we'd want to test them separately. We'd want to test that when I click the button here, it does the same thing. And when I click a different button somewhere else, it does the same thing. And part of the reason for this is that we want our acceptance criteria to have clear pass fail criterion. And so if I can pass on one trigger but not the other, what does that mean for that acceptance criteria? So it's easier if they are two, then I can just say pass, pass, fail, and I know exactly where it failed. If you see an and, typically an and clause will tell you that you actually have a precondition in your trigger. So if you think about something like given the user is on the checkout page, when the user enters the credit card and the credit card is valid, then the credit card is charged for the amount of the order. Although this feels right because it kind of is how we think of things, right? Like when we submit the information, then it's validated. But the credit card being valid is actually something we would check before we run the test case to see if like it does what we are expecting. So anytime you see an or in the trigger, that is a clue that something's off. It starts our test, so it executes the action and tells us what we're going to do. As I said, it does not describe the how. It does not have or and clauses. Finally, our post conditions are then. This describes everything the system does. So all the steps that the system takes, but relative to the outcome of that action. So even if the system's doing other things, if it's not related to the action that we just did, that trigger, then we're not going to put it in our acceptance criteria. You can include and clauses. As I said, this one, your thens can get pretty long, especially in your system to system interactions, because you could be doing a lot of actions from a single trigger, but you shouldn't have any else or clauses in a post condition. So it does not describe what the user does. So the user if there are users involved, it should always be in the trigger or possibly in the preconditions of how the user got to a certain place. It shouldn't describe implementation except in so much that you already have a design in place. So obviously, like if your system is designed and you know what your system is doing, you can write it to what's already there, but you don't want to artificially limit our developers with design or implementation unless it's already in place. And of course, it does not include our or else clauses. So we are about halfway through. I'll take a quick break here just to see if there are any questions before we get into our mindset shifts.
Candace, I guess in terms of alternatives to, or what this is replacing, like what do you see as this replacing?
I mean, I don't necessarily see it as replacing. It's more expanding the same kind of Gherkin acceptance criteria we would write for our user-centric products, but for our API products. So it's more expansion, I would guess, than replacing.
Okay, would you say then for API products specifically, then that this, in many cases, that there's not documentation like this previously?
So yeah, they may not be writing it in this Gherkin acceptance criteria specifically. It may be more mostly what I see is more checklist oriented, right? Like system receives the requests, or just gives a process flow. System searches, system finds the results, and system, sends a notification, which is, again, perfectly valid as a way to write acceptance criteria. It just doesn't facilitate our testing and our automated testing quite as well.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay,
So
thanks.
I'm saving some stuff for after because it looks like we're not going to go there. Um, I'll put some links into the chat also. Um, can y'all hear me?
Yep,
Yeah,
I
yeah, we
can
can
hear you
hear you.
fine.
Oh,
Thanks.
okay.
Yeah,
We
that
said
would
we
be
weren't going
great.
to go
So
there, so I was wondering where we weren't going to go.
yeah, when you struggle to find the basic information of starting with BDD and Gherkin, um,
Oh, I don't know if we lost you.
I'm wondering who I'm competing with. I'm oh, I think I know what's going on. I'm sorry. I I apparently have another audio going on my box. I was like, who's interrupting me? But so example mapping is something you can look for before you establish your rules. Example mapping is I have to kill something. It keeps interrupting me, but I have so many tabs open. Oh, I think I know where it is. I'll just kill that. Um, so example mapping, one of the authors of Cucumber gave a presentation on this at one of the Agile 20 whatever conferences recently, is how you go about establishing your use cases, actually your tests, before you even write any Gherkin, before you do any of the given when then, because what you're trying to find is the rules that you want to code. And the example mapping is, for example, if you're thinking of passwords, what are all the legal passwords? Those will give you the rules. You don't come up with the rules, you come up with the examples. And then on the other end, Gherkin doesn't actually, or Cucumber doesn't actually exercise the system directly. You have to establish step definitions, which will do things like send a request, query a database. Gherkin doesn't do that. The step definitions do. So that often there's a collaboration with the developers, write something in Java, hit the Selenium API, things like that.
Mhm.
And I can include links for that stuff at the end.
It's good to hear. Yeah, I mostly worked with SpecFlow. I haven't worked with Cucumber as much. But I know in SpecFlow, they took a lot of my ACs and put them almost exactly into, I mean, obviously they had to do the coding behind the scenes, um, but like the
Yeah, and
actual verbiage.
it all started actually before both of those. When Ward Cunningham came up with the wiki, that was just a part of a system called Fit and Fitness, which was also kind of a behavior-driven approach. But I'll put links for that in as well.
Okay. Thanks for sharing some
Sure.
additional resources. Okay. Well, we will definitely have time for some additional questions at the end, but we'll jump into our mindset shift. So we talked a little bit about the differences. So how our preconditions differ a little bit, how our triggers differ a little bit. But now I'm going to talk through kind of the two biggest mistakes that I see people make, really even just in general, but especially when they're trying to write these Gherkin or BDD style acceptance criteria for those backend systems, for that API. So the first one is that I see people swapping their givens and whens all the time. So this is true for user to system interactions as well, but when you're talking system to system, that actually becomes a little more important from that automation perspective. And so this again is partly because this is how people think. But for example, a lot of times I'll see like this first example, given the system receives a customer request when the customer does not exist. Well, the problem here is that the trigger, the thing that actually kicks off the test case, is in the given, and then the when is really something we should be checking before we run our test case. So it's a small difference here, but it does make a difference in terms of how we automate it, because that trigger is what tells us to kick off the test case. So we'd probably write it more like, given the customer does not exist when the system receives the request. So now we have that in our when in that trigger so that we can actually put it in, say, a spec flow, or we're going to talk a tool that we've been using, Workato, here in a little bit. I'll show you an example that I've actually done myself. So that one's pretty small, but it's one that I see it's definitely the most common across all types of acceptance criteria. The second one is very specific to the system to system interactions. And this is that when BAs or product managers, product owners, when they start doing those technical acceptance criteria, those API, database, they want to write them just like they write their user to system interactions. So in a user to system interaction, I can walk step by step. The user does something, the system does something, the user does something, et cetera. But you can't do that with system to system interactions, because typically you're talking, I send an API request in, the system does a bunch of stuff, and then I get a response out. I can't stop that API, that system, in the middle of its processing to see what it's doing. So I have to focus on what the inputs are that I can put into that process and the outputs that I get out. So you would not do something like this, given the customer exists in the database. When the system finds the customer, then the system moves on to the next step. Well, because this AC isn't testable by itself, because I can't stop the system from doing what it's doing. The second one is testable, but the first one is not. So given the customer has been found, when the system is processing the request, then the system will update the sales tool with the customer data. So if I think about this and I think about how I write this, and I call this scenarios versus steps. So I think of the scenario. What are the inputs that I can put into the system and the outputs that I can check? Outside of looking, say, into the code and running it in debug mode. I mean, yes, there are ways we could break things, but as a product owner, I'm not going to go in running things in debug mode. So what is it that I can test external to the system? So we would focus that in this case, I can check the database to see if the customer exists or not. I can check the sales tool to see if it was updated with the customer data or not. And I could see if we returned an error. So I would write my ACs or my scenarios around that interaction. So given the customer exists in the database, when the system receives the customer request, then the system searches, finds the customer, and updates the sales tool with the customer data. Given the customer does not exist in the database, when we receive the customer request, then we will return an error. So now here, with this example, I can test each one of these independently and say, yes, it passed based on what I sent in and what I could check beforehand, or maybe I got an error, or maybe I sent in a customer that didn't exist and I don't get an error. So it failed. I have a bug in my system. So those are I know that went pretty fast, but those are two mindset shifts that I think about as I'm going through my acceptance criteria. So before we do our exercise, we're going to just walk through a couple of ACs. And so you guys, if you want to jump in, you can come off mute and say what's wrong with our acceptance criteria. So we'll have our first example. Given the application is searching for deals, when a deal is in a closed won state, then the application will include its amount in the year-to-date sales total.
The given and when are switched.
Yes. So we have swapped our givens and our whens. So the system really couldn't detect the state of that data, and it is the searching that is the trigger. That's a good call. What about our second one here? Given one or more closed won deals exist, when the application runs the weekly sales report, then the application will search for all the closed won deals in the sales tool.
There's no end state for validation on that then clause.
Exactly. Yeah. So we don't, how will we know that the system searched? Is it displaying the results to us somehow? Is it logging it somewhere? So either we're missing a then of something the application should do with those search results, or potentially this is a step in a larger process and we're not seeing the full scenario. So this is that scenarios versus steps mindset shift. And our last one, given the customer data received is missing some required information. So we received the information, but it's missing the information that we need to put it in the sales tool. When the sales tool returns the error, then our application will log the error and stop processing the request. This one's a bit of a trick one.
In general, it looks okay to me. I guess the two
It
acceptance
has an and.
criteria, maybe.
Has an and.
And the then is okay, so that's not too bad. And generally, this is probably the closest to a correct acceptance criteria. But
Yeah,
here,
I guess I would wonder what the required
How do you know
information
it's
is.
not?
Yep. Yeah. So we'd want to know what the required information is. I didn't want to overload the slide, but yes, from a given, we'd want to know what required information was missing. Does someone else speak there too? Okay. But the real one that I'm looking at here is, again, it's very small, very minute, but it's when the sales tool is giving the application versus us receiving, not application, sales tool returning the error versus us receiving the error. Very, very small. In general, it never matters, right? Because it's almost instantaneous. When we're talking API calls, if you give me an error, I should receive an error. But I have had this actually make a difference, specifically when we're talking like middleware or like message queue type systems. So I was working on a large project once that was going through a RabbitMQ. And so being the lovely smart PO that I was, I always wrote that, our system kicked off when we received the message in our message queue and not when the other application sent the message to the message queue. And it turned out it took a lot of triaging and debugging, but it was actually important because it turned out I didn't have a bug in my system. It was that the RabbitMQ itself had logic in the exchange for how to route the messages. So even though the system upstream was sending the message, yay, we were never getting the message. And so we had to, obviously we still had to go fix it, but it was easier to say that I can only take action when it hits my queue, not necessarily when you send it. So it just helps if you run into any of those weird edge cases like that. Okay, so we're going to practice. We're only going to have probably 5 to 7 minutes. We don't have breakout rooms. Normally we would do this with breakout rooms or groups. So we'll do this individually. But we've walked through what BDD is, about our acceptance criteria, kind of the changes in system to system interactions. But I always find it's best if you get to practice a little bit. So we're going to have a system flow on the next slide here. And we're going to try to write some acceptance criteria for it. So for this, we're going to think about the scenarios versus steps. So what are my inputs and outputs? And thinking about keeping our givens and our wins straight. We're going to have very short time on this, but I'll come back and I'll show you what I came up with when I was creating this presentation. And this is I try to keep it simple. So this is a simple process for a shared services team that has a shared mailbox. And when they get emails to that mailbox, we have an automation that will go search to see if the sender of the email exists in Salesforce as a contact. If it does, then we will just create a case for that email so that the team can work it. If they do not exist as a contact, they'll create the contact as well as create the case. And then if there are errors, we'll send errors to a Slack channel. Otherwise, we'll send successes. So with this, we're going to make the assumption this is all one user story. So you don't have to worry about trying to break it up into different user stories, but write our acceptance criteria for this user story. We'll do about 5 minutes here, get through 1 or 2 at least. It's about 3 more minutes. One thing I'll ask is, as you're walking through this, how many acceptance criteria do you think we would need to fully cover this flow? So as you're writing just a 1 or 2 down, think about how you would figure out how many we need in total. Okay, just 1 more minute. This is more fun in groups, but hopefully everybody will at least get 1 or 2 acceptance criteria out.
Yeah, I hear mention of Fit and I hear mention of Cucumber and SpecFlow and I haven't used SpecFlow, but um
Don't know if we lost Jeff again. Probably about 30 more seconds for this exercise.
so the trick with these tools is that so do y'all hear me when I talk?
You keep cutting out.
That's odd. Okay. I mean, the thing about these tools, all of them,
Oh, and we cut out again.
Yeah. Yeah.
no,
may
I
have to-
stopped talking because someone else started.
Is that
Nobody
you,
on this
or
call
are
started.
you hearing your own echo?
No, I'm not hearing an echo.
Okay.
Anyway,
Candace, yeah, if you
I'll
just
try
wanna-
and complete my sentences and maybe y'all will hear them. Um, the idea behind all these tools like Fit, when Ward did that, it was
Hey Jeff, you keep cutting out, so
Yeah.
I have some
what's
other sound that somehow
okay.
is entering into the conversation, and I don't get it.
Okay, yeah,
Oh,
Candace, if you want to
Right.
continue
yeah.
I'm
on.
gonna look for something. Oh, I think I found something else competing. Yeah.
Yeah,
I
we can try
only
again
have
at the
like
end.
100 things open. The idea behind the tools is to bring the test cases out to where the product owner or the BA are, but you still have to get to where you can educate the system. And the question is, someone's going to have to write code, whether it's fitness, whether it's Cucumber, beyond the Cucumber and beyond entering things into the spreadsheet. You're actually going to have to write Java code to interface, or you're going to have to use some code to hit a database or hit an interface or whatever. And so I always see it as a collaboration. Maybe you'll need to leverage some of the libraries already in use, and maybe um, uh, it's code that's been written by the team already. But another thing that kind of comes up in the middle of this, we talk sometimes about the system in a black box sense. There was a concept called testability that I only heard about like 40 years ago, that uses two terms, controllability and observability. I don't know how many have heard that. Observability's kind of been hijacked by the DevOps world now. But if you've got a black box and you're struggling to diagnose it, it's because the system wasn't made testable in the first place. So another thing you can do while you're coming up with these test cases in this code is ask for the interim interfaces that show you more of what's going on, what's under the covers. So you may end up with more test cases simply because you don't want just the front end creating whatever comes out the back end.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Those are good points and some good examples. Yeah, and so this exercise is more about writing those acceptance criteria so that it's easier to automate, but you're right, you're still going to have to do that coding in whatever tool you're using.
Right.
But so we'll go ahead and take a look at a couple of these examples. We only have a couple of minutes left. So these are just two examples here because I didn't want to overload the slide. I can quickly show the end at all of them. But some things here, you're given is that your precondition is that we've sent an email to the queue and we can check that the email exists. When we receive that email, then in this case, we're going to search for the contact. We'll create a case because the contact already exists, and we'll post a message in the Slack channel. And then here I gave an error once when we receive the error. So SFTC would give an error. So maybe, we're missing something that the case needs. Or if maybe, a field is too long, your subject line is too long for the SFTC case. When we get that error, then we'll receive the error and post a message in there. So just to finish up here, as we're walking through the scenarios, and I will talk through about how many ACs we have, our ACs basically become, so each scenario through the process. Oh, go ahead.
Candace, can you give me remote control?
Who wants remote control
No,
and
no,
why?
yeah, I think I'm just gonna
I have
go
something I
ahead.
need to show you guys.
I'm going to remove her. Okay. Go ahead, Candace, please continue.
That's interesting. Yeah, so as we're looking through our scenarios through that process flow, that system flow, that becomes our ACs. And so my sneak peek is that you should have gotten 6 acceptance criteria out of that process flow, and we'll talk through why. It can be easy just because of how we think to swap our preconditions and triggers or to go step by step. And of course, we talked about this mainly as a tool to help speed up our automated testing. You still have to do the code. It's not going to stop that, but it helps us talk in kind of that pseudo code way with our engineers to help them be faster at their jobs. So I'm going to show just a quick thing. So I actually built this. We use a automation tool called Workato. So I actually built this flow quickly, and then I was able to write the test cases, just one for one from each of my acceptance criteria. Now, of course, Workato makes it very easy. If you're using a different tool, your coding could be more difficult, but just one way to show how this works. And then lastly, so my last thing, because I talked about how do we identify those scenarios? How do we know that there are 6 in this system flow? And now, obviously, if you are breaking this up into multiple user stories, this doesn't hold true. But if you have one flow that is one user story, it is all your unique paths through your flow. So you can literally just take if you had this printed out, you could take a highlighter pen and walk through each way you could terminate the process. So you could go through the happy path, no error. You could go through an error path. You could go through other error paths. I'm just going to walk through all of them. Oh, there we go. And then you have 6 total. And what's fun about this that I love, so I worked with Carl Wiegers last year when we were writing our book, is that this is something you can do even before you write your acceptance criteria even, or before you even have any code at all. Because if you're highlighting your path and you don't have an acceptance criteria, then you're missing something. Or if you have an acceptance criteria that isn't one of these paths, well, then either your flow is missing something or you're writing ACs for something that doesn't exist. So 6 paths, 6 unique paths. And I know that's a lot of lines on the page there, but that would give us 6 unique ACs. And the other kind of bonus here is anytime you see a decision, those are likely to lead to your preconditions. So that error contact found or those errors gives you a lot of your precondition combinations. So with the last 2 minutes, just our couple of takeaways. So BDD, just in general, whether you're writing it for user to system or system to system interactions, BDD is a powerful quality aid to get everybody thinking about those test cases, to bring, as Jeff said, to bring the test cases to the BA and to the PO, and have everybody collaborating on them. Just because there are no users doesn't mean we can't use our BDD style acceptance criteria. So if you have those APIs, you can use them as we talked about. And we just have a couple of different mindset shifts. Oh, step 5 fails repeatedly. No, I'm not going to allow that. You exit out. Now I have to take a look. But yeah, just remember those mindset shifts when you're practicing. And at the end of the day, most of the time, these small differences, if they're not perfect, the developers will still catch them. They'll still automate them correctly. But if we can kind of do some of that up front and have those mindset shifts, it just makes their lives easier and makes testing easier. So with that, I'll open it up for questions with the last 2 minutes.
Could you show that ricotta slide again, please?
Oh, yes. Do you want to see the actual recipe or just the slide?
How do you spell that?
It is, here. How do you spell it? WORKATO. So this is a recipe. It's kind of an automation tool that we've been using internally.
Thank
So
you.
go ahead, Linda.
That's what I needed. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah. So Candace, I was kind of curious about the length of the test scenarios that you saw, because where I've seen BDD and even just in general end-to-end test cases fail is when you start to chain everything together and tests become flaky and then all hell breaks loose. So is there any work or thought about test decomposition? Because when I went through the exercise, I actually was able, at least for these scenarios, to kind of decompose into just maybe 3 or 4 steps per system. So can you talk a little bit about maybe step decomposition for complex systems?
So I guess what 3 or 4 did you break down to? This is my full list, by the way, the 6 that I have.
Yeah, so I'll post in the chat, but this wasn't refined at all, but kind of when you got to the new context step, in other words, you would have a separate scenario, because instead of going end to end through the whole system, where any one step failing would then mean you're not testing the rest of the system, you would have a new contact actually created for your next scenario, and then you would go through the error states, thereby kind of working through the system in a more decomposed fashion. So I don't know, can you kind of talk about anything that you've done along those lines?
Yeah, so typically, if you can, like if the process would actually stop with the creation, then you could stop and show that. I think some of the problems we run into with the system to system is you can't stop. Like if the contact creation was successful, you move on to the next step, right? So you would really want to test both things. But you could test all the error conditions, as you said, separately, because errors would, let me go back to the process if I can. Right. So the error would stop the flow, would terminate the flow. So you obviously, if you have an error, then that would end the flow. But yeah, the way, so you could validate that you create the contact, but you can't, but if the new contact has been created, then you would create the case. You would not get an error
Right.
unless there
So
was an error on creating the case.
for sure, like essentially, where the way I've worked it in the past is you're setting up pumping data into a test system on a regular basis to be able to have data in particular states. And for sure, there can be small gaps in it, but where I've seen things fail most often is when you try and go through a whole flow time after time. And flakiness, especially in test systems, causes
Mhm.
those things to error out. So I guess just something to consider.
Absolutely. And the test setup, we spent a lot of time on our project, like creating the test system that could create the test data reliably so that we could do whole flows like this. Because you're
Yeah,
right, if you're trying to rely on existing test data versus like creating your own each time, you can run into lots of errors.
cool. All right, well, thanks. Yeah, I know we are over time. I guess maybe if there's one more question that someone has on their mind that's burning.
Hi, I have a brief question. Um, so going back to the flow diagram that you have, right, that slide. So let's say that you have a feature and you have created the flow diagram for that feature, right? Is there any recommendation in how to start tackling? I heard you say that possible paths within that flow would lead you to start creating those acceptance criterias, but let's say that it's bigger than the one that you showed. Is there any additional recommendations on that case?
Yes. Yes, I made a very big assumption, right, that this was one user story. So if you have a bigger flow, you really have to think through like how do I chop those user stories up? And I think of things like how do I independently implement it and test it? So it may be like maybe for example, as Ben said, maybe I only get as far as creating the new contact, and that's the first story. And then the next story, I do the case creation. So you have to, as long as you can independently test it and implement it, you can kind of slice and dice your stories however you need to. The other interesting piece, you didn't bring it up, but the other side of that is what happens when you're adding logic to an existing flow. So if you're like adding step, like if I have this flow and I'm going to add another, I don't know, I'm going to see if a deal exists for this contact. If I add that flow, then I have to write my acceptance criteria towards what already exists as well as what I'm adding. So I can do kind of regression testing to make sure that I didn't break anything that already works. So it definitely can get a little long. And that's why I also like having external regression kind of suites as well to refer to. So I hope that helps because the other, like where exactly to slice and dice the stories becomes very situation specific.
Yeah, no, I think you addressed the questions. Like it's an existing system that is driving the question right now, and I think that slicing will be helpful for the team I work with. So thank you.
Well, thank you for your time, Candace, and the presentation. Really enjoyed it. And we will have the recording up on our YouTube channel probably early next week. And then we can also get the slides from Candace, get that posted back to the meetup page.
Yep.
And yeah, thanks again for everyone's participation and appreciate everybody's time and have a good weekend. And thanks again, Candace. Any final words?
No, thanks for joining us. Have a great weekend.
Okay. All right. Take care, everyone.